Facing shipwreck seems like a very pertinent kind of topic. And there are so many people in our country right now that are facing so much financial difficulty, businesses going under, loss of job, wondering where their next meal is going to come from, relying on others because things have been closed for so long. Shipwreck kind of explains the life of a lot of individuals in our nation today. In Acts chapter 27, there is a storm that arises on Paul's journey to Rome, which is horrendous and disastrous. The chapter begins this way. When it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia, which is exactly what they do. They make a couple of stops, and then at a place called Myra, they find a larger ship that's more worthy of sailing all the way to Italy. It's classified as an Alexandrian ship in verse number 6. Carries a total of 276 people on this voyage. But the time for sailing safely in the Mediterranean really is past. Paul makes a statement. There's a perception that he has about this journey that he actually voices beginning in verse 10. I perceive that this voyage will end with much disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our own lives. So that's his perception. The supposition of the centurion and the helmsman of the ship, the captain of the ship, the owner of the ship, no, we're going to find some good weather. And in verse 14, when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by the island of Crete. The perception of Paul, dangerous voyage, the supposition of those who have the privilege of making the determination about sailing or not, believe that, well, that soft wind, that's going to be our ticket, but it doesn't last very long. The word that describes the storm is a compound Greek word. Most lexicons would refer to it as a southeast wind that creates a tremendous amount of swells in the open ocean. So much so that down in verse 15, the ship was caught, could not head into the wind. They just let her drive on her own, sail on her own. Finally, they take down the mainsail. They use cables to undergird the ship because the planks, it's so violent, the planks seem like they may buckle and come apart. Verse 19, on the third day we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Verse 20, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and no small tempest beat upon us, all hope that we would be saved was finally lost. Perilous position, difficult days. Think everything's going to go your way, and it really doesn't. Everything goes wrong. Beginning in verse 21, after long abstinence from food, Paul stood in the midst of them and said, "You should have listened to me, and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship." Talks about a message that he's received from an angel who said, verse 24, "Don't be afraid, Paul, you must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted all those who sailed with you no loss of life." Now down in verse 26, there's another element that Paul mentions. We're going to run aground. We're going to run aground on an island. We're not really going to make it to Rome on this vessel. They took soundings. They found that they were kind of coming close to land. In verse 29, they dropped 4 anchors to keep from running into the rocks and totally being destroyed. Verse number 30, some of the sailors were endeavoring to lower one of the skiffs which still existed, that they could actually make their escape. And Paul says that unless these men stay in the ship, they're not going to survive. So the soldiers, verse 32, cut away the ropes to the skiff and let it fall. Beginning in verse 33 down through verse 38, Paul encourages them to take food. It's an exhortative statement. It's a statement exhorting them, encouraging them, and trying to build up their spirits. When he said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them, and when he'd broken it, he began to eat. They were all encouraged, verse 36, and also took food themselves. Then it mentions in verse 37, 276 people on the ship. Beginning in verse 39, they don't recognize the shoreline. They actually let go the anchors and hope that the ship can make it safely to the beach. It doesn't. It breaks apart. The soldier's plan is to kill the prisoners. The centurion doesn't want that to happen. So these individuals who could swim jumped overboard. The rest, some on boards and some on parts of the ship, came to land, and all escaped safely on the island of Malta, south of Italy. It's difficult in very dire circumstances to be optimistic when that shipwreck seems imminent, and it seems like everything, all of your hopes and dreams are going to be dashed to pieces. It's very difficult to try to get through that unscathed. Back in 1914, there was a fire that destroyed most of the buildings owned by Thomas Edison. He had done quite a lot already. There were millions of dollars worth of damage that insurance would not cover. The New York Times, if you go back and archive the time of that fire, record him as saying, he's quoted in the newspaper, "I'm over 67 years old, and tomorrow I'm going to start all over again." And there's a famous quote that's attributed to Thomas Edison on this occasion that was heard by some of his co-workers. And they're worried about him as he watches. He's exhausted the next day because he doesn't leave the site. All the sorts of fire departments are brought in to try to quell the blaze. But according to what has been recorded, he says to those co-workers, "Thank goodness all our mistakes are burned up. Now we can start fresh." And there are several statements from various witnesses to that occasion that talk about the stoic nature of Edison. And it wasn't that he wasn't emotional about the destruction, but he's very pragmatic in his approach. I've read in the past that with a lot of individuals that have amassed a great deal of wealth because of their business acumen, that if they were to lose everything within a year or two, they would have just about as much as they lost, because they don't see it as the end of the journey. They see it as a way to begin with something new, maybe something better. There were a lot of inventions, a lot of patents that continue to come out of those laboratories. Edison did not give up. He's right. The next day he started all over again. We face storms of life to a certain degree every day. This one seems extremely severe. But we can recover. We can put life back together. With God's help, it can be better than it was. What kind of faith and what kind of focus do you possess through these difficult days? And as you face your own shipwreck, or that great storm that threatens that shipwreck, what kind of thoughts go through your mind? What kind of focus do you have? How strong a faith do you possess? Acts chapter 27. Very intense chapter, very detailed chapter about Paul's voyage and the shipwreck on the way to Rome. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.